Okay, so third video for Math 196, Spring 2014, solving quadratic equations. This is section A7. One thing to note before we get into the actual solving of quadratic equations is the difference between equations, that's this stuff, and expressions. So an equation has an equal sign in it. And the two sides of the equation are what we call expressions. So expressions, what we've done so far in this class, we've been playing with expressions, we've been factoring them, simplifying them, distributing them, but we haven't actually been solving equations for x, for example. So here's where we start. So solving quadratic equations. A quadratic equation is one where something is squared. Alright, and so here's a quadratic equation because there's something squared, and we'll solve this using the square root method. And section, this should be A7, not A6. A7, problems 1 and 2 are like this. And the idea is that with the square root method is if you have something squared and there's no term with x in it at all by itself, then you can just solve for the squared term and then take the square root. So we'll move the 2 over to the right side. 2x plus 3 squared over 4. Add 2 to both sides equals 7. And then multiply both sides by 4. 2x plus 3 squared equals 28. And now we have something squared by itself. So take square root. Of both sides. The square root of something squared is just whatever is inside, and square root of 28 is plus or minus square root of 28. Remember, there's always two options for a square root, right? There's always a plus or minus. So square root of 9, for example, is either 3, 3 times 3 is 9, or minus 3, because minus 3 times minus 3 is also 9. Great. And now we have an equation that we can solve for x. 2x equals minus 3 plus or minus square root of 28. X equals minus 3 over 2 plus or minus square root of 28 over 2. This can be simplified a little bit if you want. I mean, this answer is fine, but square root of 28 is, well, 28 is 4 times 7. So this is square root of 4 times square root of 7, which equals 2 square root of 7. So x is minus 3 halves plus or minus 2 square root of 7 over 2, or minus 3 halves plus or minus square root of 7. Generally, you can stop here, right? This is enough. You don't need to simplify out square roots. Okay, so that's one way to solve a quadratic equation. We have something squared, so it's a quadratic. If you can solve for the thing squared by itself, then you can just take square root of both sides. Okay, factoring. So again, A7 problems 5 and 6 are like this. Solve this for x. Well, to solve by factoring, you need 0 on one side of the equation, and we'll see why in a couple minutes. So we'll subtract a 4 from both sides, and this equation becomes 6x squared minus x minus 2 equals 0. So there's our 0 on one side. Now we can try to solve by factoring. This needs the AC method of factoring. 6 times minus 2 equals minus 12. So what does that mean? We need two numbers multiply 2 minus 12, add to give us minus 1, right? Because the coefficient of x here is a minus 1. So multiply to give you minus 12, add to minus 1. if you work that out a little bit, the only option that really works is minus 4 and 3. Minus 4 times 3 is minus 12. Minus 4 plus 3 is minus 1. So we'll replace this term, the minus x in our original term, with minus 4x plus 3x. Because that's where minus 1 is minus 4 plus 3, minus 4x plus 3x. So what do we have? We have 6x squared minus 4x plus 3x minus 2 equals 0. And now we can factor by grouping. Right? What can we take out of these first two terms? Well, a 2x, and that leaves you with a 3x minus 2. And what can you take out of these? Not much, but we notice there's a 3x minus 2 here and a 3x minus 2 here. So we'll put that sucker in parentheses. Great. Now what's common to both of these is a 3x minus 2, so I can factor out the 3x minus 2. And what's left behind? Well, a 2x. If I take everything out, that means there's a 1 left behind. Great. And this is why we want equal to 0. Right? This was on, I think, one of the quizzes, the first quiz, or the first quiz on Thursday. Two things multiplied together to give you 0. U times V equals 0 means either U equals 0 or V equals 0. I think that was on quiz 1 or 2, as I said. But this times this equals 0. That means either 3x minus 2 equals 0 or 2x plus 1 equals 0. You move the 2 over and then divide by 3. X is 2/3. Or move the 1 over as a minus 1 and divide by 2. Minus 1/2. So there's our two solutions to our quadratic equation. Why do we need a 0 on one side of the equation? Because when we factor the expression on the left-hand side, we got this. And so now we have two things multiplied together to give me 0. That's why I need the 0 on the right-hand side. And that allows me to say, okay, well, either this term is 0 or that term is 0. So x is 2/3 or x is minus 1/2. Note in both of these problems, we get two answers, right? Minus 3/2 plus or minus root 7. So there's two answers, one for the plus and one for the minus. And here we got two answers, one for the first factor and one for the second factor. So that's two ways to solve quadratic equations, the square root method or factoring. They don't always work. Here's something that always does work. So problems 9 and 10 are from the quadratic formula. You will be asked, you will not be given the quadratic formula on a you'll not be given the quadratic formula on a test or on a quiz or anything. You have to have it memorized. So if you have a quadratic written in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, again is 0 on the right hand side, then x is given by this formula, negative b plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So example 3, solve for x if possible, but apparently I didn't write in what the example was. And so our example is 4x squared plus 7x plus 12 equals 0. And so note, we can't use the square root method on this because we have this non-squared term here, right? The square root method, the first example that we did, means that you have to be able to find the squared term all by itself without something that's not squared, so we can't use that. Factoring this, well, you'd need to find, if you use the AC method, two numbers that multiply together to give you 48 but add together to give you 7. And that's, you might be able to do it, but that's hard. So we'll just use the quadratic formula. Which is pretty easy, right? You just, if you've memorized it, just plug everything in, right? I always put in my horizontal line first so I don't get totally screwed up. So negative b here is 7, so b is the coefficient of the x, so it's 7, plus or minus b squared. b is 7, so that's 49, minus 4ac. So that'd be a 4 times a, which is a 4 times 12. Oops. That example isn't quite what I wanted. I think I wanted a 3 here, actually. There we go. 4 times 4 times 3. Sorry about that. Okay. All over 2a, which is 8. So, x equals negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 49 minus, well, 4 times 3 is 12, times another 4 is 48, all over 2a, which is 8. So x equals minus 7 plus or minus the square root of 1 over 8, which is minus 7 plus or minus 1 over 8. And we'll make that 8 look a little bit more like an 8 and less like a little shapeless blob. Okay, so 2 answers. You can go with the plus. So x equals minus 7 plus 1, which is minus 6 over 8, which is minus 3/4. Or x equals, you can go with the minus. Minus 7 minus 1 is minus 8 over 8, which equals minus 1. And so those are two answers. X equals minus 3/4 and x equals minus 1. Now finally, here's another example. Example 4, solve for x. Oops, we have a little bit more to do after this example. Okay, so here a equals 6, b equals 4, c equals 4, x equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared, which is 16, minus 4ac, 4 times 6 times 4, all over 2a, which is 12. So x equals, draw on my horizontal line first, minus 4 plus or minus 16 minus, well, 16 times, no, 4 times 4 is 16, 16 times 6 is 126, all over 12. And so if we actually do that subtraction in the square root, we get something a little disturbing. You get minus 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 minus 126 is minus 110, all over 12. And that, no negative numbers in square roots. Can't do that. Okay. Technically you can, but that gets into something called complex numbers, and we don't really want to go there. So for us, we just say this has no real solution. So if you get a negative number inside the complex, if you get a negative number inside the square root, then there's no real solution to it. And so that's a nice thing about the quadratic equation, is that it tells us whether or not it's possible to solve for x. For this one, it's not possible because you get a negative inside the square root. For this one, it is possible because we got a positive number inside the square root, so everything worked out. Factoring, right, doesn't tell you whether or not it can be factored. It's just, you know, some things can be factored easily, right, like the AC method, and some things can't. But things that can't be factored easily can sometimes have actual solutions. So the quadratic formula always works. It might be a little bit long sometimes. Sometimes factoring is easier. But the quadratic formula will tell you if something doesn't factor, which is nice. Okay, so most of the problems in section A7, not in A6, are, well, these problems, and they just say factor them. Solve these equations. They don't say factor them, they say solve these equations. And don't tell you how to go about doing it. Remember that there are three ways: the square root method, right, which is get the squared term equal to a number. and then you can take the square root of both sides. If you have a term that's got, if you have an x squared term and an x term, then this won't work. Factoring. What do we need to remember about factoring? Well, the AC method. And one side has to be 0. Right? So remember that the factoring is to get this times that equal to 0, and so you need the 0 on one side, so you can say either this is 0 or that is 0. And then 3 is a quadratic equation. Always works, but can be a little bit of a problem. You need your quadratic equation to be set up in this particular form, and then you can say x is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. But you need to have it multiplied out like this and equal to 0 on the other side for it to actually work. Okay, so that's the basics of solving quadratic equations. Make sure you memorize the quadratic formula. That's this thing here, and that will